They say love is the strongest bond, that those who claim to love you will stand beside you when the world turns against you. That family and devotion create obligations that cannot be broken by circumstance or fear. And I believed this when I was 22, believed it with the certainty of someone who had never been tested, who had never faced a moment when love had to choose between comfort and courage, between safety and solidarity. And I learned differently. Learned it in the span of 3 days that transformed me from beloved daughter to accused witch to forgotten outcast. Learned it through words spoken against me that I never said, through looks interpreted as guilt that meant nothing, through love that revealed itself as conditional, as negotiable, as something that existed only while I was convenient, and vanished the moment I became complicated. And this abandonment was worse than the accusation, worse than the condemnation, worse than the cell and the trial and the sentence. Because betrayal from strangers is expected, but betrayal from those who claim to love you is a different kind of death. Is the murder of your ability to trust. Is the destruction of your belief that anyone will ever choose you when choosing you costs them something. And I survived the trials, survived the imprisonment, survived what should have killed me. But I have never recovered from the abandonment, from the understanding that the people who said they loved me only loved the version of me that fit their lives. And when that version became inconvenient, they discarded me without hesitation, without struggle, without even the decency of visible conflict. And perhaps this is the truest lesson about love, that it is fragile where we want it to be strong, conditional where we need it to be absolute. And most people will sacrifice others to protect themselves when the choice is forced. And knowing this has made me harder, has made me someone who cannot love easily, because I understand that love given can be withdrawn, that devotion professed can be denied, that family itself is not protection but another vulnerability, another way to be destroyed. My name is Abigail Fenwick, and I was born in Salem in 1670 to a family that was prominent and respected. My father was a magistrate. My mother came from old money, and I had 2 younger sisters and a brother. And we were close, genuinely close in a way that felt rare and precious. We told each other everything, protected each other, defended each other against the world. And I believed our bond was unbreakable. Believed we would always stand together. Believed that family was the foundation everything else was built upon. And I loved them fiercely. Loved them with the kind of devotion that makes you vulnerable because you cannot imagine a world where they might hurt you. And I was happy, was content with my life, was preparing to marry a man my parents approved of, was moving toward the future that had been laid out for me. And I had no reason to think anything would change. No warning that the world I knew was about to collapse. No preparation for what was coming. The accusation began with a misunderstanding. Began with words I spoke that were overheard and misinterpreted. Began with me being in the wrong place at the wrong moment, saying the wrong thing to the wrong person. And it happened so quickly that I had no chance to explain, no opportunity to clarify, no space between the accusation and the acceptance of the accusation. And suddenly I was not Abigail Fenwick, beloved daughter and respected member of the community, but Abigail Fenwick, suspected witch, and everything changed. Everything, in the time it took for rumor to spread through Salem streets. And I watched people who had known me my entire life look at me differently. Look at me with suspicion and fear, and the particular kind of fascination that comes from watching someone fall. And I kept thinking this was a mistake. This would be corrected, someone would explain, and everything would return to normal. And I waited for my family to step forward, to defend me, to use their position and influence to stop this madness before it went further. and they did not. They did not speak, did not defend, did not use any of the power they possessed to protect me. And this silence was the first abandonment, the first indication that something fundamental had shifted, that I had moved from beloved to liability, from daughter to problem. It started on a Tuesday afternoon when I was visiting my friend Elizabeth Walsh. Visiting her because she had been ill and I brought her soup and company. And while I was there, her mother asked me about healing, asked if I knew herbs that might help Elizabeth's lingering cough. And I did know herbs, had learned from my grandmother who had been skilled with remedies. And I told her about horehound and thyme, about how to prepare them, about dosages and timing, and I thought nothing of it, thought I was simply being helpful, thought knowledge shared was kindness. And I left Elizabeth's house feeling good about the visit, feeling I had helped a friend. And I returned home to find my mother waiting with an expression I could not read. Something between anger and fear. And she said that Mary Walsh, Elizabeth's mother, had been speaking to neighbors, had been saying that I claimed to have special knowledge of herbs, that I had spoken with unusual authority about healing, that I had perhaps learned these things from sources that were not entirely wholesome. And my mother said I needed to be more careful, needed to understand that in these times any knowledge that seemed too deep or too specific could be seen as suspicious, could be seen as evidence of dealings with darkness. And I was confused, was trying to understand how sharing my grandmother's remedies had become suspicious. And my mother said it did not matter whether it was innocent. What mattered was how it looked. And I needed to be aware that people were watching, were listening, were ready to interpret anything unusual as evidence of witchcraft. And I felt the first flutter of real fear, felt the understanding that I was being judged not by what I had actually done, but by how my actions could be interpreted. And interpretation was subjective, was influenced by fear and prejudice, and the need to find someone to blame for every misfortune. The second incident happened 2 days later. Happened at meeting when I was sitting with my family, as I always did. And the sermon was about vigilance against Satan's influence, about how the devil worked through seemingly innocent people, about how we must be constantly alert for signs of corruption. And I was listening, was paying attention. And at one point I looked up at the minister and our eyes met, and I must have had some expression on my face, some look of concern or concentration. And after the service, one of the elders approached my father and said he had noticed me staring at the minister during the sermon about witchcraft, said my expression had been strange, had been almost defiant. And this elder wondered if perhaps there was a reason I had reacted so strongly to discussion of Satan's work. And my father thanked the elder for his observation and said he would speak to me. And when we returned home, my father took me aside and asked me what I had been thinking during the sermon, why I had looked at the minister the way I had. And I said I had not been aware of looking any particular way, had simply been listening, and my father said I needed to be more careful about my expressions, about how I presented myself, about giving people any reason to wonder about me. And I understood then that the suspicion was growing, was feeding on itself, was taking innocent actions and transforming them into evidence, and I was being watched, was being interpreted, was being judged by every glance, every word, every gesture. And there was no way to be innocent enough when innocence itself could be read as guilt. The formal accusation came on Friday, came from Mary Walsh, who stood in meeting and said that since I had visited her daughter and offered herbal remedies, Elizabeth's condition had worsened, that the cough had become worse, that Elizabeth now had fever. And Mary said she believed I had not been trying to help, but had been trying to harm, had been using my knowledge not for healing but for curse. had perhaps been testing my power. And she said too that I had looked at her strangely when she thanked me, had smiled in a way that now seemed sinister. And she asked the community to consider whether I might be witch, whether my knowledge of herbs was natural or supernatural, whether I should be questioned, and I sat there in shock, sat there unable to process what I was hearing because I had helped, had tried only to help. And this help was being transformed into attack. My kindness was being reinterpreted as malice. And I waited for my father to stand to defend me, to use his position as magistrate to stop this before it went further. But he did not stand, did not speak, simply sat beside me with his face unreadable. And I waited for my mother to say something, to testify that I had learned herbs from my grandmother, that this was family knowledge and nothing dark. But she too remained silent, and I waited for my siblings to defend me, to speak up, to do something, but they sat frozen. And I understood in that moment that I was alone, that whatever was happening, I would face it alone. And this understanding was worse than the accusation itself, was the beginning of real terror. Because if my own family would not defend me, then who would? If those who loved me most would not speak, then what chance did I have against the community's suspicion? They took me that afternoon, took me from my family's house to the prison, and my family watched in silence as the constable led me away. And I looked back at them, looked at my mother and father and sisters and brother. And I tried to communicate with my eyes what I could not say aloud, tried to ask them why, tried to plead for help. And I saw in their faces not grief or anger, but something worse. Something that looked like resignation. Like they had already accepted this outcome, like they had already decided I was lost. And my mother turned away first, actually turned her back, and my sisters looked down, and my brother put his arm around our youngest sister. And my father just watched with an expression that was blank, that showed nothing. And I was taken to the cell, and I sat there in the darkness trying to understand how this had happened. How helping a friend had led to this. How 3 small incidents, 3 nothing moments had accumulated into accusation, into imprisonment, into the real possibility of execution. And I kept thinking my family would come, would bring lawyers, would use their influence, would do something, and I waited through the first night, through the second day, and no one came, and I understood that they had already abandoned me, had already decided that saving me would cost too much, would risk too much, would associate them with accusations they could not afford, and they were choosing themselves over me, were protecting their own position and reputation and safety. And I was simply the cost of that protection, simply the sacrifice they were willing to make. The trial was set for the following Monday, set quickly because my father as magistrate expedited it. And I learned this not from him, but from the guard who told me almost apologetically that my own father was involved in scheduling my trial, was ensuring it happened quickly, was not recusing himself despite the obvious conflict. And I felt something break inside me, felt the last hope die. Because if my own father was not just failing to defend me, but actively participating in my prosecution, then there was no rescue coming. There was no last-minute intervention. There was only the machinery of accusation grinding toward its inevitable conclusion. And I would face it completely alone, without family, without advocates, without anyone willing to speak for me. And the isolation was suffocating, was worse than the cell, was understanding that I had been erased from my family, had become inconvenient and therefore invisible, had been loved conditionally, and the conditions had changed. My mother came to see me the night before the trial, came alone, came when the guard could be bribed to allow it. And I thought perhaps she was coming to apologize, to explain, to offer some comfort. but she came to ask me to confess. Came to tell me that confession was the only way to survive. That if I admitted to witchcraft and named others who practiced with me, I might be spared execution, might be imprisoned instead. And I said I could not confess to something I had not done, could not name others when there were no others to name. And she said I was being stubborn, was being selfish, was thinking only of myself when I should be thinking of my family. And I did not understand what she meant. How was I being selfish by maintaining my innocence? And she explained that my trial would be public, would be attended by everyone of importance in Salem. And my father's reputation depended on how this was handled. If I fought the accusation, I would make the family look defensive, would make people question whether my father had been blind to corruption in his own home. But if I confessed, if I admitted guilt and accepted punishment, then my father could be seen as a man of integrity who put justice above family, who did not let love compromise his duty. And this would actually enhance his position, would make him more respected, more trusted. And she was asking me to confess not to save myself, but to save them, to sacrifice my own integrity to protect their reputation. And I looked at her, and I said I would not do it. Would not confess to something I did not do just to make them look better. And she looked at me with something like disappointment, and said I had always been stubborn, had always put my own needs above the family's. And she had hoped I would be more mature, more understanding of the bigger picture, and she left me there without comfort or support. Left me understanding that they had already made their choice, that I was already sacrificed in their minds, and the trial was just formality, just the official completion of an abandonment that had already occurred. The trial was worse than I expected, was not just accusation and judgment, but theater. Was my father sitting in the magistrate's seat looking stern and impartial while testimony was given against me? Was my mother sitting in the gallery looking appropriately shocked by the accusations? Was my siblings attending and whispering among themselves and never meeting my eyes? And witness after witness testified about small things, innocent things that were transformed by interpretation into evidence of guilt. And I tried to defend myself, tried to explain that I had only been trying to help, that my knowledge was from my grandmother, that I had never practiced anything dark, and my words were dismissed, were seen as the lies of a witch trying to avoid judgment. And when my father asked if anyone would speak for me, if anyone would testify to my character, there was silence, was long, terrible silence. And I looked at my family and I waited for any of them to stand, to say they knew me, to say I was good, to offer any defense at all, and they sat silent. Sat there and watched me beg with my eyes, and they gave me nothing, offered me nothing. Simply sat there as if I were a stranger, as if we had never shared a home or a name or love. And I understood that I had been disowned, had been erased from the family as thoroughly as if I had never existed. And my father read the verdict of guilty without any visible emotion, without any acknowledgement that he was condemning his own daughter. And he sentenced me to hang in 2 days, and he did it in a voice that was steady and clear. And I saw people in the gallery nodding approvingly, saw them thinking that this was integrity. This was putting duty above personal feelings. This was what a good magistrate did. And my father was building his reputation on my execution, was using my death to demonstrate his righteousness. And my mother was supporting this, was presenting herself as the sorrowful but strong mother who accepted God's justice even when it hurt. And my siblings were learning from them, learning that family was conditional, that love had limits, that sacrifice was acceptable when it benefited the survivors. And I was the lesson, was the example, was the demonstration of what happened when you became inconvenient. I spent the next 2 days in my cell waiting to die. Spent them trying to understand how love could transform so completely into abandonment. How family could become strangers. How people who had held me and protected me and claimed to cherish me could watch me die without protest. And I could not make it make sense. Could not find the logic in it. Could only accept that it had happened. That I had been wrong about everything. That the love I believed was absolute was actually nothing. Was performance. Was something they said and seemed to mean, but did not actually mean when tested. And I grieved not for my coming death, but for the family I had lost, for the love that revealed itself as lie, for the belief I had held that I mattered to them, that I was more than convenient. And this grief was more painful than fear of hanging, was the understanding that I had lived my entire life believing a fiction, believing I was loved when I was actually only tolerated, only accepted, only valued while I fit the role they needed me to play. And the moment I became complicated, I was discarded. And they did it easily, did it without apparent struggle, did it while sleeping peacefully. And this ease was the worst part, was understanding that I had mattered so little that abandoning me required no effort, no conflict, no pain, just simple calculation that I was not worth the cost of defending. The day of my execution came, and they led me to the scaffold, and the crowd was large. Was hundreds of people come to watch the magistrate's daughter hang. And I saw my family in the crowd, saw them standing together, standing close as if for mutual support, and they were dressed in black as if in mourning, as if performing grief. And I walked past them, and I stopped and looked directly at my father. And I asked him out loud, asked him so everyone could hear, if he truly believed I was a witch, if he genuinely thought his own daughter had made pacts with Satan. And he looked at me with eyes that were cold and said it did not matter what he believed. Said evidence was evidence and justice was justice. And I understood that he knew I was innocent, knew I was being sacrificed wrongly. And he was doing it anyway because my innocence was less important than his position. My life was less important than his reputation. And I said so everyone could hear that he was murdering an innocent person, his own daughter, for his own ambition. And he said I was proving my corruption by trying to drag him down with me, by lying even at the moment of death. And the crowd murmured agreement, saw my accusation as evidence of my evil rather than as truth. And my mother stepped forward and she said loudly that she forgave me, that despite everything I had done, despite the shame I had brought on the family, she forgave me and hoped God would do the same. And I saw what she was doing, saw her performing motherly suffering, saw her using my execution to demonstrate her own righteousness, to show the community how strong she was, how faithful. And my siblings stood silent behind our parents, stood there like props in a performance of grief. And I climbed the scaffold understanding that I was dying not just because of accusation, but because of abandonment. Not just because of what strangers thought, but because of what my family chose. They chose their comfort over my life, chose their position over truth, chose themselves and let me fall, and this choice was theirs. Was not forced by circumstance, but selected from options. And they would live with it, would tell themselves it had been necessary, would convince themselves they had done the right thing, would sleep peacefully while I died. And the noose went around my neck, and I looked at them one last time, and I saw nothing in their faces. No regret, no guilt, no love, just blank performance of appropriate emotion. And I understood that they had already forgotten me, had already moved past me, had already decided who they would be in a world without me. And I was gone to them before I was gone to the world. And they pulled the lever, and I fell, and darkness came. But darkness was not ending. Was not death but something else. Was waking in cold and confusion. Was being told I had been saved. Had been cut down after death was declared. Had been brought back by those who practiced the old ways. Who had seen the injustice and intervened, and I was alive, impossibly alive. And they said I could return to Salem, could demand justice, could expose what my family had done. But I said no, said I wanted nothing from Salem. Nothing from my family, said they had already made clear what I was worth to them, and I would not beg them to reconsider. Would not give them the opportunity to reject me again. And I chose to stay dead to them, chose to disappear, chose to become someone else somewhere else. And I learned that the women who saved me were right. That family means nothing when tested. That love is conditional regardless of what people claim. That blood provides no protection, creates no obligation, means nothing when set against self-interest. And I built a new life, built it with people who chose me not from obligation but from genuine care. And I learned to trust again but differently. Learned to give love while holding back the part that would destroy me if withdrawn. Learned to protect myself from the kind of abandonment I had experienced. Learned that the only person who would always choose me was myself. And perhaps that was the lesson. Perhaps that was what survival required. Understanding that you are alone, fundamentally alone, and any connection is temporary, any love is conditional. Any family is just people who might stay or might leave depending on cost. And accepting this aloneness is not cynicism, but realism. Is not giving up on love, but understanding its true nature. And I survived. Survived the accusation and the trial and the hanging and the abandonment. Survived all of it and became someone who could not be destroyed by being left. Could not be broken by being unloved. Could not be unmade by being discarded. Because I had already been discarded by those who should have held me, and I was still here. Still whole, still breathing. And their abandonment had not killed me, though it had tried. Had transformed me instead. Had made me harder and colder and infinitely more careful about who I gave myself to. And perhaps that is victory. Perhaps that is justice. Living when they thought I would die. Being strong when they tried to make me weak. Existing when they tried to erase me. And they are still in Salem playing their roles. Still performing righteousness. Still sleeping peacefully. And I am here, am everywhere else. I'm living the life they thought they had ended. And every day I exist is proof that their abandonment failed. That love withdrawn cannot destroy unless you let it. That family lost is just people you no longer have to forgive. And I forgive nothing, forget nothing, and I survive. And survival is enough.